AM 560, The Answer.
We're at 46 officially at O'Hare. Next news 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So last night on 60 Minutes, it was the first convening for a group interview of the Five Eyes, and Scott Pelley was giddy with enthusiasm over the prospect.
Such
Five
a
Eyes.
weird segment, wasn't it?
The Five Eyes are the essentially top G-men for the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the U.K.
They look like superheroes walking down the street. I mean, it was so goofy. It's the Five Eyes. I'm Scott Pelley.
So the topic was, in part, at least with Christopher Wray representing the United States, in part it was about the conflict between Israel and Hamas and what we're doing about the hostages and what we're doing to protect the homeland. And it was just bromides. And frankly, you know, as momentous as this gathering was supposed to be, they were out talking to CEOs in Silicon Valley. There was a lot of cliches. Their focus was not Ukraine. Their focus was not Israel. Their focus was Communist China. And that's why they were out in Palo Alto and in Silicon Valley, Palo Alto at Stanford, and then in Silicon Valley to talk to these CEOs in tech. As Christopher Wray explained, from his perspective, the global espionage threat the Chinese communists present.
The technology secrets that are about to change the world in artificial intelligence, biology, and computing are falling into the wrong hands, stolen in a global espionage campaign by China.
The People's Republic of China represents the defining threat of this generation and this era. There is no country that presents a broader, more comprehensive threat to our ideas, our innovation, our economic security, and ultimately our national security. We have seen efforts by the Chinese government, directly or indirectly, trying to steal intellectual property, trade secrets, personal data, all across the country. We're talking everything from Fortune 100 companies all to small startups. We're talking about agriculture, biotech, healthcare, robotics, aviation, academic research. We probably have somewhere in the order of 2,000 active investigations that are just related to the Chinese government's effort to steal information.
Don't tell that to LeBron James. The British's MI5 director, he offered more context to this in terms of how the Chinese communists operate, efforting to compromise employees of sensitive businesses, both big ones as well as startups in sensitive technological spaces.
So we see the theft happening in a range of ways. One is that we see employees within those companies being manipulated. Often, in the first instance, they are not aware of what is happening. We have seen, for example, the use of professional networking sites to reach out in sort of masked, disguised ways to people in the UK, either who have security clearance or who are working in interesting areas of technology. We've now seen over 20,000 examples of that kind of disguised approach to people in the UK who have information that the Chinese state wishes to get its hands on.
Sure, we've seen that here with Eric Swalwell falling for the honeypot. No, we get it. And also this has particular relevance to Illinois. Chinese communist companies overseen by the People's Republic. You know, I don't know, like perhaps an electric vehicle battery plant in Manteno, Illinois.
The intelligence chiefs told us Chinese companies are overseen by the Communist Party, and for many, espionage is a sideline on behalf of the PRC, the People's Republic of China.
Is the Chinese government building industrial sites in your countries that are actually covers for espionage operations?
David Vigneault of Canada.
We have seen in the past acquisition of land, acquisition of different companies, where when you start to dig a little bit further, you realize that there is another intent, and we have seen and blocked attempt by the PRC to acquire locations near sensitive strategic assets of the country, where we knew that the ultimate purpose was for spying operations.
Somebody's going to have to tell the Five Eyes that according to the governor of Illinois, anybody who would raise any such questions is a xenophobe. So what you saw there are apparently 5 xenophobes. That's according to Governor Pritzker. Ken Pollack is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of Armies of Sand, The Past, Present, and Future of Arab Military Effectiveness. Ken Pollack, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Dan.
One of the other things that the Chinese communists have done recently is move half a dozen warships to the Middle East to make sure their presence is felt there as that conflict develops, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is something that we've been seeing for really the past couple of decades, and especially in the last few years, which is, China is expanding its global presence. It is particularly focused on the Middle East. To some extent, it's on economic considerations. They've got a lot of deals out there. They certainly get a tremendous amount of their oil, but that oil really is translating into a strategic interest in the Middle East. And the Chinese want to make sure that if there is ever a war with the United States, say over Taiwan, that they can lock down their interests in the Middle East. And it's playing into China getting involved in the Middle East in a whole variety of different ways. Some somewhat helpful, others much more unhelpful. And in the recent crisis, they've taken, in effect, Hamas's side fully as a way of kind of driving a wedge between the United States and its Arab allies.
And so is this, we talked about this with the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Does this unrest, war, really, in Gaza, does this provide that much more incentive for Xi to move on Taiwan in the not-too-distant future?
Potentially, absolutely. This is one of these circumstances where, again, there are all these well-meaning people who are saying, let's have a ceasefire. We got to have a ceasefire. We don't want any more people to die. And obviously, nobody wants more Palestinian civilians to die. Nobody should want any more Israeli civilians to die as well. But we need to recognize that right now, Hamas and Iran have won huge victories. Right? They have taken Israel by surprise. They slaughtered 1,300 Israelis, again, including women, children, infants, the elderly. Just a horrific action. Shutting down that war now simply hands that victory to Hamas and Iran. And if they believe that they can win more of these, they'll keep doing it. And I have no doubt that the Chinese are watching carefully. If the West is not willing to defend its interests, that will be a very important signal to the Chinese about Taiwan.
Colin Rugg, who a lot of people follow on Twitter, he said that China has reportedly deployed multiple warships to the Middle East region. Mm-hmm. Is this true? And how many? He's reporting up to 6 Chinese warships are being deployed to that area.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, Amy, but that sounds right to me. And again, it's exactly what you would expect. The Chinese are taking a much greater interest in the area. They are looking for opportunities to advance their own interests, typically at the expense of our own.
You suggest in Peace and Foreign Affairs that this conflict between Israel and Hamas could be limited. It doesn't have to necessarily spill over into southern Lebanon with Hezbollah, into Yemen with the Houthis, into Iran with the mullahs. So obviously the conflagration is the concern. Why is there some prospect that it could be more limited?
Yeah, I think this is very important, Dan. And first, let me start by saying, one, wars are unpredictable. I would never say don't be worried about escalation. And two, I've been warning for years about the potential for a region-wide war. But in this case, I think that it's important to recognize that there's already a lot of evidence that both Iran and Hezbollah are not looking to fight Israel. And that should not tie our hands. It should not tie Israel's hands. That's one of the things I'm worried about. The biggest, most important piece of evidence that I can cite in favor of that is Iran, and because of Iran, therefore Hezbollah, knew about this attack beforehand. So if they had wanted to, they could have joined Hamas in the original attack on October 7th. That was the time for them to have attacked Israel if they wanted to do so. That was when Israel was most surprised, when it was least prepared, when it was least able to defend itself. Had Iran and or Hezbollah joined in that initial attack on October 7th, the damage to Israel probably would have been an order of magnitude greater. So again, if they wanted to fight with Israel, that was the time to do it. It's very clear that they're not looking for that fight. They understand how powerful Israel is. Unlike Hamas, they're not ready for that Israeli response. And so I think that what that signals is that the likely Iranian and Hezbollah participation in this war is going to be limited. They'll do a bunch of stuff, but like we're already seeing, they might do somewhat more. You're not going to see a Hezbollah ground offensive into Israel. They really have no capability to do so now, especially now that Israel has fully alerted its forces. You may see more rocket fire, but right now that's my best guess as to what you're likely to see. And again, for that reason, we shouldn't let this threat of escalation, which you know has been tying the Biden administration's hands constantly over aid to Ukraine. We should not allow the same thing to tie either our hands or Israel's hands when dealing with Hamas.
Well, these other actors, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, are they maybe just being more circumspect? They want to see how the West reacts. They want to see how the Arab world reacts before they, run headlong into Panzer fire the way that Hamas is.
Yeah, to some extent. But again, if they wanted to do this, they could have participated on October 7th. They would have done enormous damage to Israel. Again, they might choose to get involved, but what's really important, especially for Hezbollah, is how Israel responds. And they've experienced that beforehand. They saw it during the Second Lebanon War of 2006. And it's very important to remember that while the world remembers the Second Lebanon War of 2006 as a humiliating Israeli defeat, which at a political level it was, at a military level, Israel still did tremendous damage to Hezbollah, so much so that Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, afterwards famously gave an interview in which he said, if I had known how Israel was going to respond, I never would have done it in the first place. Right? They're still in that
That's where
mode.
you want them. Yeah, that's where you want them, that's for sure.
Is it true that the Egyptians, though, warned the IDF that, hey, that we're hearing chatter that an attack might take place?
As a former CIA officer, these are the kinds of things that you hear all the time. It's possible that happened. It's also possible that this is just a rumor, that this is something that the Egyptians are putting out. We will find all of this out when this is all said and done. The Israelis are always very thorough about conducting these, deeply searching probes to figure out when something went wrong, why it went wrong, and how to fix it. There's going to be one after this war. That's when we'll find out exactly what happens.
What do you think China is, how is China processing, I guess I should say, the response from the Arab world?
So I think at the moment, China is very much in a kind of wait-and-see response. I think that they look at this and they say, this was a very clever move on the part of the Iranians and Hamas, their allies. And of course, Hamas has many similar interests as Iran, but they've also got some of their own. But from the Chinese perspective, this looks very clever on Iran's part because, again, this was a very clever way for Iran to derail the rapprochement that had been going on between Israel and the Arab states who were forming a military alliance against Iran, right? And this is Iran breaking that alliance apart. That's exactly the kind of thing that China would like to do in East Asia, right? Break apart the alliance between the United States and its allies that are trying to contain China exactly the way that Israel and the Arab states are hoping to contain Iran. So I think that the Chinese looked at that and said, this looks like a very clever gambit on Iran's part. We want to see how it turns out, which again is why it's so important that at the end of this, Hamas be seen to have failed miserably, because that's the only way you're going to convince whether it's the Iranians or the Chinese, or for that matter, the Russians or other aggressive countries, that you cannot succeed in this fashion.
He is Ken Pollack, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, author of Armies of Sand, The Past, Present, and Future of Arab Military Effectiveness. Ken Pollack, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
I'd like to tell you about something that speaks to the very core of our values as Americans, a veteran-owned company on a mission to make a real difference in the lives of our military members. Talking about Pure Talk.